Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome to the 80 Series Land Cruiser video. The 80 Series Land Cruiser is a very beloved Land Cruiser model. It is the last Land Cruiser model that is serious about off-road. Not that the others are not, but this is the model for off-road. They're super rugged. They just look amazing. Look at them. And they have a huge following. This is the last model that folks will call a proper off-road truck. 100 series, got a little bit softer, got more luxurious, more comfortable. In my opinion, a better everyday car, but this is a serious rig here. However, there's the truth that's going to bother some current 80 series owners or enthusiasts. The newest Land Cruiser 80 series you can buy today is 28 years old. So with that come a lot of problems. And I see this all the time. The face of disappointment of new owners that just bought one when the repair bill comes out. Folks, in today's video, I want to share with you some things you should definitely know before you buy an 80 series. And if you own an 80 series today, there are some things here that you're going to need to know about. Some of these truths will be a little bit difficult to hear, but it's the truth nonetheless, and we're going to share it. Let's start with the engine category. The Land Cruiser could have, the 80 series, could have two possible engines. If you have a 91 or a 92, you have the 1FZE. Old school. And those motors, as well as good as they are, I'd avoid them if I were you. Because they were so archaic, so underpowered, and at this point so old. This is the oldest two models. I'd actually avoid them altogether, because finding a good example of these that runs well, doesn't have every single common problem, is very low. 93 and up, you have the 1FZ FE. Did have some changes throughout. Right around 95, it got a lot better. 96, 97, of course, they are OBD2 now. 95 was the first voluntary OBD2 year. Anything before that is going to be OBD1. I would rather get the OBD2 model if I were you, because you can connect the scan tool, you can read basic codes, things that are a little bit more modern. I mean, nowhere near as modern as 25 standards, but better is the word I'm going to use here. They were better. That's the one thing. There's something I'd like you to know about the 1FZ FE engine. It is a good engine, but I am just I'm trying to find the right word here. It behooves me how they were able to get this little power out of an engine that is literally belongs in a semi. That's how it feels like. Because when you put the 1JZ, the 2JZ engine, which is right around the same time as this engine, it really looks like half the size of it, and they're both inline six. That's the thing with the 1FZ. It is completely unnecessary. If they would have put a 2JZ here, for example, would have worked even better. Would have made more power and would have done exactly the same thing. This engine does make decent torque. It's a nice engine. It's kind of a truck engine, but just know that they have their quirks. And let's go through this engine. There is something about the 1FZ that you need to know. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and it's a guarantee. You're going to have oil leaks and coolant leaks, and once you fix the last oil leak, the first oil leak you fixed just started leaking again, and same thing with coolant leaks. They just never end. That is in the reality you have to accept getting into one of these, because first they're old, second they were actually from a different mentality of design. See, the 1FZ was used in a lot of stuff overseas. They were not really meant to be this leak-free, perfect engine. You need to know that going into one. With that, let's talk about some of their common spots of leaks. The very common stuff, even back in the day, valve cover gasket is notorious to leak. Not a difficult valve cover gasket to do, but it's a giant valve cover. It's kind of strange to have it in your hand. It's massive. It's the biggest valve cover you're going to hold in any Toyota. Even a V12 has a smaller valve cover. Then the rear main seal loves to leak on these. I mean, you'll replace it 5-6 years later, it's leaking again. That's just how the name of the game, if you would. And then the front crank seal loves to leak on these. I mean, they have an issue with front and rear crank seals. They love to leak. This is even when they were newer, they were like that. Then we get to the kind of the age-related leaks. Front timing cover loves to leak on this engine. Here's a problem with the front timing cover on this engine. The cylinder head sits on top of that cover. So if you're going to do that cover, you have to pull the cylinder head off and do a head gasket and the front cover. That's the biggest thing. The second thing is power steering pump leaks. They will appear as a pump itself is leaking, but it's actually the seals that are leaking. They're leaking engine oil because it's connected, and it's kind of a strange power steering pump setup here. And then the other common leak here is if you look all the way at the very bottom of the front of the engine, a little bit towards the driver's side, there is a cover that covers the oil pump. Has a tiny little O-ring, loves to leak and manifests itself as a front timing cover leak. If you see oil leaks from the front cover on this side of the engine, on the passenger side, that's a front cover. But if you see it on that side, I would clean it and reseal that. Now, heads up on that, they decided to use screws, not bolts, to hold that little cover, and they can be fun to remove when they seize up. I will go ahead and make a small, bold statement. Unless this engine was just pulled out and then the whole thing resealed, every single 80 series you're going to go out and look at will have some kind of oil leak. That is just the norm, folks. These are old cars, and this engine was not really a tightly sealed engine. Is always going to leak. That is one of their things, and if you have a problem with that, perhaps look at the 100 series. That's all I'll tell you. Now, coolant leaks, and this is a big one with this engine. I mean, I've seen so many of these go down because of coolant leaks. The first thing you look at when you open the hood, if you have an 80 series with an original radiator, please, let's fix that right away. They love to go, and it'll kind of go at the worst moment, and it'll overheat, and the head gasket is gone. They do have. I don't want to say this engine has a known head gasket issue, but they're old. It's going to happen. So don't push the head gasket with a leaky radiator. And then you have the heater valve at the back. This is, of course, we're talking old school stuff. Whenever you turn on the heater, there's a coolant valve that opens and sends coolant to the heater valve. That valve loves to leak. It's just plastic, and it sits right there, super simple, super DIY to replace. But if you have an original one, or it looks like wet or leaky or has residue of coolant around it, just replace it. I'll be on the safe side. Then there is it's very interesting that the DIY community actually calls it that, the pesky heater hose. I actually have a name for it. So there's a heater hose, it's almost like underneath the intake manifold. It connects to a couple pipes, and it loves to leak. That hose is notorious to leak with age. But I'm just surprised that the 80 series community only talks about that hose. I mean, at this point, all the hoses will leak at this age. So if you're worried about that one hose, I would be worried about all of them. So if you own an 80 series and you're new into it, I'd start slowly replacing all the coolant hoses, because they will leak and you will not notice them, and it will overheat the engine. And now you have the hoses and the head gasket. That is something with these you really gotta be on top of, because the cooling system on this is so ancient that it doesn't take much to overheat this. That is one thing you gotta be on top of. Otherwise, if these have a lot of miles, they could burn oil, but most of the oil burning, in my opinion, is from leaky head gasket. It'll leak on the walls and eventually wear down the cylinder walls where it starts burning oil, but they're not super notorious with other problems. You're not going to have rod knock all of a sudden. You're not going to have valve train issues and chain issues. They're not really known for that, but of course with age, anything is possible. Let's take a tour underneath this 80 series, and this one is the white one, which is in pristine condition. That's all I'll tell you. But you're going to notice that even though this is a pristine example, you're going to see a majority of the common problems we already talked about, and then we're going to add to it. Things you really got to check with these, because things can get out of control if you don't, and you just buy them just because the body is clean. For example, the interior is clean. The first thing on every single 80 series Land Cruiser, which is becoming kind of the make or break the deal type thing, the front knuckles. Folks, this has a live front axle. This is not, a differential and CV joints and whatnot. This is a proper off-road setup here. But with that come the problems. This is why they don't do this anymore, because it's just not durable. That's the problem. Look in this area. Do you see all this, what appears to be grease, old grease? Now, some of that somewhat is normal. Don't see that and go thinking this is leaking. Now, I'll show you an example of one that is leaking very little. If you look here, you see that? That's actually live grease. It's getting past the wiper. So here's where we're at. Inside of this, there is grease, and then there's a drive shaft that comes up. There's a Burfield joint here, basically a glorified CV joint that drives the wheel. In this knuckle, there is grease. This grease is separate from the gear oil in the differential, and there's a seal right here. What happens with time is one of multiple things could happen. If this axle seal leaks, it's going to either leak gear oil into the knuckle, or this grease will start making its way inside the differential housing. Both of them are not good. There's also a big wiper here to not allow the grease inside this to come out. So what you're seeing here is very little amount, and most of this looks dry. If you touch it and it looks dry like this is not an active leak. This one, on the other hand, you see how it's not this? There's a dry stuff here, but there's wet stuff here. This wiper is starting to leak a little bit, but this is not cause for alarm. What is, though, when you start seeing this, the first thing you do is take this cap off right here. This is a cap. Take a sample of that grease. If it's very runny and watery, you have gear oil here. That means that axle seal is leaking. That means we need to do something about it, because you're either going to destroy the differential eventually, or you're going to destroy all your bearings. Unfortunately, this is one of these. That's the first thing you do. You check that and it's not runny. You take the fill plug of the diff, look at the fluid. If you see streaks of grease in the fluid, you have this grease that have made its way in this fluid. We need to take care of the seal. And when you take care of the seal, you're going to do the wipers, you're going to do all bearings, preferably do the brakes if you're there. Just do the rotors at least. You're going to do the whole job. And here's the problem. The Burfield. Burfield, for some reason, is astronomically expensive for these. Here's how you test the Burfield. So you're going to buy one. Make a super sharp turn as far as the steering wheel go one way, and accelerate a little bit hard. If you hear continuous clicking sound, even faint, one of the Burfields is making noise, and here's the reality. If one of them is making noise, the other one is not far behind. And you just added a multi-$1,000 repair to this new rig that you're looking to buy. Do the same thing on the other side. Do it multiple times. Make sure whatever 80 series you buy, you make a full sharp turn and accelerate hard, and listen for any clicking sounds. If you hear them, these are the Burfields. And whatever you do, do not buy an aftermarket one when you replace them. Buy an original. You buy an aftermarket one, we'll see you in a year. That's just how this works. That is the first common thing with these. This is the biggest thing. You gotta check this. Now, you've had a 80 series that the seller is telling you, oh, we just had this job done. Don't take their word for it, because they could have had this job done. I want to see original parts. Where is the receipt with part numbers that you did this? Because if you used all aftermarket parts, see you in a year for the same job all over again. That's just how this works, folks. Some folks will disagree. That's okay. If you want to know what is involved in this job, I'll leave this video right here. Detailed doing this job on an 80 series, but that's how you do it right. The original parts to keep things going well. The next thing that you're going to check, even more important than that, which will completely make you walk from the car, rust. Do not buy a rusty 80 series. You will be very sorry. That's all I'll tell you. Look at this frame. This is a non-rusty Southern car. Basically looks brand new, the frame. There's absolutely zero rust on this. You find an 80 series like this, it passes a rust test. Then we move on to the next thing. You see any kind of rust or heavy corrosion and everything is rusty, be careful, because I'm not worried about the frame. I'm worried about the rest of it. Brake lines, suspension stuff, everything you touch will be rusty. The exhaust will fall apart. Be careful with these. That is one very important thing, rust. Then this pristine example, watch what we have here. This is the oil leaks we talked about. You notice that on the driver's side, I don't have much oil. On the passenger side, I have a lot of oil. This one actually has a front cover that is leaking. That's the problem. Crank seal is dry, it's been done. Oil pan has been done. And if you notice, we actually have an upper oil pan leak that is small. If you look right here, this area is wet. Somebody cleaned it, but it's getting wet again. It's more on this side, but you can't really see this side is really tight. But then again, this is another common one. Rear main seal is leaking. Now, if you have a really heavy leak from the front, you're gonna need to pull this cover and look up. You'll immediately see it. They're notorious for the rear main seal, either the seal or the housing that sits it. Then the exhaust. You notice even the exhaust has a little water drip. That is actually normal. Don't be alarmed by that. Make sure the exhaust is in good shape, because these catalytic converters, they are so expensive, it's unbelievable. Don't buy one with cut up exhaust and all aftermarket stuff everywhere. Don't do that, because they will fail, especially if you have an OBD2 one that has to pass emissions. Be careful with catalytic converters, because things get expensive here. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is this object that sits here that you will never have to do much with but change the fluid. Transmission. They actually don't have a lot of transmission problems other than pan leaks, regular stuff like that, but they don't have anything chronic with transmissions other than leaks. Same thing with the transfer case. Of course, it's an older car, things will wear down, but they don't have chronic stuff. Now, transmission mount, yes. Especially from age, they're gonna wear down. Same thing with engine mounts. You get excessive vibration when they're idling. This is one of the first things I would check. If you see cracks or collapsing mounts, that's something I would get. The next thing is, this is for owners, not really a common problem. Greasing the drive shafts is an important thing that you do this very regularly, because they love to dry up and they'll cause all kinds of drivability issues. As we move back, I cannot emphasize how important it is that you buy a rust-free one. They're out there, folks. It's worth so much that you pay for one that looks like this. That's all I'll tell you. Because brake lines will rust, fuel tanks will rust, body will rust, frame cross members will rot. I just cannot emphasize how important it is that we do not buy a rusty one. Now, coming in the back here, don't quote me on the exact year, but I want to say 93, 94, somewhere around there. They switched the style of the rear end to a fully floating rear end. So in the past, you used to have an axle shaft that went through, and you had a little clip that held that axle shaft in place. You pulled it, it locked, and we're good. They changed that style to this. This is a much better style. If we come around, there's bearings here, just like the front. Not exactly like the front, because this doesn't turn, but you have bearings here. This is fully serviceable hub. Unlike the other one, where it's everything you want to do with the axle, you have to pull the cover off the diff and pull the thing. It just makes it a lot more complicated. If you have the old style, you have to pull the cover off the diff, pull the C-clip, pull the axle, to all that just to do an axle seal. While here, you don't actually have to do that. Another thing, although I warned you about rusty ones, but this is something you're going to see even with mild rusty ones, not super rusty ones. Parking brake. You see this crank? You can reach underneath the truck and just pull on these. Make sure they move, because this is actually what applies the parking brake, and they're notorious to seize. See how this one moves? If they don't move like that, this is something you're going to have to address. Now, if you don't never use a parking brake, I get it, but this is one of their common things. Now, the rest of remember this, the newest one is 28 years old. Bushings will go, bump stop here is notorious to break. Like the bushings here, every single bushing is separate. There's a bushing here, bushing here, bushing here, all these little bushings. They're going to deteriorate with time. Same thing with the front. You have bushing here, bushing here. You have another little link with a bushing here and the joint there. Suspension on these is not notorious to have a lot of issues, but the little bushings, yes. Shocks, yes. And lastly, and this kind of, we skipped over it when we were here, steering gear. You're gonna go through a few of these in the life of the 80 series. That is something. And another thing is, the rusty ones, they could break the mount here. But the rusty ones, not the non-rusty ones, we're not going to have issues with those. And of course, we have this little dampener here for the steering. It's, yeah, they're also notorious to leak. This one has been replaced already with an original one, but you'll see this all wet. But the main thing is, you look underneath an 80 series, I want you two things to be the top priority. Number one, is it rusty? If it is, walk away immediately. Do yourself a favor. Don't even waste your time with anything else. If you see rust, walk away. Simple as that. Do yourself a favor. Well, if it passes the rust test, are my knuckles good? You see wet? You need to check it. If the owner tells you, well, I can't have you check it, tell them, enjoy your truck, have a nice day. Because if the burr fields fail on the test drive, there's a major red flag. I cannot tell you how expensive they are, the originals, to do it properly. So be careful with that. Make sure you pay attention to that. After that, you're going to look at the amount of oil leaks, and you're going to need to determine, has this been leaking for the past 15 years or maybe the past year or two? If it's covered with oil from here all the way to the back, all over the frame and all over everything, that's a bit much. But you see something, small stuff like that, little wetness here, one drip here, one drip there, not huge amounts, I can live with that. You will never have an 80 series that is 110% oil leak free unless you pull the engine out, tear it completely down, replace every single seal with original parts, which are starting to get really hard to find. Then you're going to have a leak-free one for a few years, then we're back to it. That's just how it is with 80 series, folks. These are old cars, old designs, things were different back in these days. So you got to keep that in mind. We can't have 100% leak-free Land Cruiser 80 series unless you're willing to spend a small fortune. And in this case, like the case of this car, I'm not too worried about it. This is not a car we're going to take for cross-country trips every other week. This is an enthusiast collector car. You're going to have a few drips here and there. It's not the end of the world unless you want to spend the fortune. And then you're just going to park it there. It's going to start leaking again. That's the thing with these. You got to keep that in mind. Lastly, on the wheel bearings, this is something, because this is the last thing that ties into it. You want to check a wheel bearing on these. Top and bottom for play. Same thing on the other side. Top and bottom for play. See this one, I feel it, you might not be able to see it, has a little bit of play. So this particular car is actually in our shop. This is a customer car. We took permission to use it for the video. It's coming up on a burr field noise that is very minor. The wheel bearing has a very little amount of play. This is not a sealed wheel bearing, so this is different. If you have a little bit of play, I'm okay, but you got to be conscious that it's coming up on a replacement. But I would at least adjust it. Wouldn't hurt. Now this particular car is coming up on a burr field replacement. It makes noise, so we're not going to charge them for all this and then redo the whole thing all over again. We're just going to plan for it and do it. But this is another thing you want to check is the bearings. If the bearings have a lot of play, this job might be needed sooner than later, which means the big expense is coming up. And if you're looking to buy this car, maybe consider that as a factor in the negotiations of the price. Let's talk about electrical stuff. Now, the 80 series is super basic when it comes to electrical. There isn't much going on. Things are basic. However, they're older cars. Things are going to happen. I'm going to mention two kind of common things, and one of them not as important, but something you need to know about these. Windows. This is one of their things. If you own an 80 series, it is normal for them to, windows don't want to go down, don't want to go up when it's cold. Now, some folks will suggest that if you replace the rubber on the run channel, it will get better. And it will for a little while, and then we're back to the same thing. Folks, these are notorious for window motors to go out. They don't go out completely. When the weather is cold, these seals shrink, and now the glass has a lot more resistance on it. So the motor being weak, you increase the resistance on it, it's just going to barely work until it just cuts out. So it's actually not the seal that causes this issue. It's the window motor. The window motor for the 80 series, they still make them. They're available, believe it or not. They are astronomical. That's the only word I'm going to use here. They're so expensive that folks will go, I'm just going to buy an aftermarket one. Well, you're going to do it again in a year or two, and again and again and again. It'll never work right until you put the original one. Then, boom, see you in 10, 15 years. That's how this works. The second thing is the beautiful antenna. This is a power antenna. It has a switch to make it go up and down. It's such a beautiful thing until it stops working or it gets hit and broken like this one. So here's the biggest problem. It isn't usually a power antenna on a Toyota is the easiest thing to fix, super DIY, except when the little ribbon, so this antenna basically has a white ribbon that kind of wraps around the gear, and that's how they come up and down. Except when that ribbon breaks inside the motor, and then you can't install the new one. Because usually in other models that have this, you just pull the whole antenna assembly out, take the cover, pull the old ribbon out, close it, put it back, we're good. How do you exactly do that in this? Through here? You can't do that. This is one thing that is very strange. So this only applies to the newer models. I'm going to say 93 and up. Don't 100% quote me on this, but I believe it's 93 and up. The way you access this is through here. It is super tight space and super, it will test your patience. You have to remove the cruise control module, there's a little resistor here, you move it, and then there you have a tiny little opening that you can actually get the antenna motor out of. Very difficult job. Tests your patience. I mean, it's not difficult, but it's a very tight space. That's what's difficult about it. But if you have one that unfortunately left the ribbon inside, which is actually pretty common on these, and you want this to work, this is such a cool feature of these trucks. Unfortunately, you have a small battle coming up. It's doable, but just know that I rarely see motors go out. It's usually the ribbon that gets stuck inside. So what are the best years to buy in the 80 series? If you're enthusiast, you're looking to buy one, they really appeal to you and they're really nice, and they are. What is the best year to buy? In my opinion, if you can get your hand on a really nice 96 or 97 that checks all the boxes, that would be the one I would get. If they're outside your budget, can't find one, 95 is the last one I would get. Anything before that, I would be a little hesitant, because usually finding a good example pre-95 is a lot more difficult. Because when these came out, this was just another Land Cruiser. But as the time progressed a little bit, people kind of started paying attention to them. So later model owners took care of them a lot better than the early ones. And then the early ones, they had a lot more issues than the later ones. So you're going to see much better examples of 95 to 97 than you're going to find 91 to 94. 91 and 92 possibly are the worst years to buy today. Now, if you own one, it's been great. That's good. But today, going to buy one, these are the worst years to buy. Folks, let me share with you the last thoughts on this. Buying an 80 series Land Cruiser, I want you to ask yourself right before you start actually looking for one, if you really want one, I want you to ask yourself one question. What is this truck going to be? Is it going to be a kind of a fun truck to drive it here and there and enjoy it, maybe do some overlanding with it, off-roading here and there? Or is this going to be a car you actually drive every day? Because if you're going to drive this every day, it's going to bankrupt you. That's the sad reality, the shocker of 2025. It's going to bankrupt you because it will never end. You will always be fixing something or another. It will never end. That's the reality. And the bigger problem with that is, if you want to fix these properly with original parts and do things right, their repair is astronomical. I mean, a 200 series Land Cruiser is a fraction of cost of repair compared to these. That's even though they were triple the price when they were new of the 80 series. But that's the reality. These are old and these are complicated in today's world because parts are difficult. Every project you take is going to turn into 3 other things that got added to it because they are old, folks. The newest one is 28 years old. You gotta keep that in mind. Yes, they are well built. Yes, they are super well designed. People will say they're super reliable. I actually don't think they're reliable. They're old, folks. You gotta keep that in mind. This is very important, and repairing them properly is a very expensive proposition. I want to give you a very important piece of information about 80 series. This is something from talking to owners, kind of looking into the community. Couple things. First thing is, who's going to fix this car? You buy this car, you can't be a person that does absolutely nothing to cars. You just drive them. When they break, you take them to a mechanic. You can't be that person. That's all I'll tell you. Because you need to DIY some stuff. That is part of the ownership experience. If you're going to have someone do everything to these cars, again, we go back to the same thing, it's going to bankrupt you. And then here's the next problem if you're going to be that person, or if you're not that person even, but certain things it's just not possible for you to take care of outside of your skill level or whatnot. Finding mechanics that work on these are becoming a problem. And some folks will jump out of their seat and say, why? They're so simple. They're not simple. Have you ever stopped to realize that? They're not simple because it's an old car. Every project you touch, everything you touch turns into 7 other things that you have to take care of. And mechanic shops today, they don't want to deal with that. They don't want to have this car sit and sit and sit while we're waiting for parts or finding parts, or the parts are discontinued and nobody makes them, and now we're just stuck with this car sitting. So finding a shop that works on these is slowly becoming more difficult because these have already transitioned from just an old Toyota model to a collector/enthusiast car. These are not everyday cars. This is something you really got to understand here. So don't be upset when you go to your local shop that serviced all your other normal cars that you drive every day. You take your 80 series, they'll be like, sorry, we don't want to work on this. Don't be offended. Actually, thank them for saying that. Because good shops that had some experience with these cars and have decided this is not our style of work that we want to take on, they are doing you a service by saying flat out, we don't want to get involved with this car. This is outside of our comfort zone. You should appreciate that, because shops that get into working on these that have no clue what they're doing could cause more harm than good. So I want you to keep that in mind. And it's not like this is some rare special car that only one person on the planet works on them. You'll find a lot of shops that will know them and have worked on a lot of them. Our shop is one of them. There's a lot of overland shops that specialize in them. There is actually specific Land Cruiser specialist shops. Here's the criteria for choosing a shop that work on these. They've got to use original parts. This is what makes these cars good or not good. I see so many of these show up. They've been restored by certain specialist companies, and we do an inspection. It's like, this is worse than one that has had nothing done to it. Flat out. Because everything is aftermarket. This is zip tied together, and this is whatever, and the car is just falling apart. That's the reality. Be careful of the restored ones. I actually rather you buy a Survivor and take care of their common problems with original parts and move on. This is very important. Fix these right. Don't cut corners. Because this is not a car you want to cut corners with, because it will cut you out. That's the problem, and things get very expensive because parts are expensive. Last thing, which is the second thing I want to talk to you about, parts. It's surprising how strong the support of Toyota for these cars, for their parts. They still actually make a lot of parts for them. And the second thing you need to be aware of is, if you're a current owner, Heritage Parts, GR Heritage Parts. Folks, Toyota has a website where you can request parts. They're made for the enthusiast car and kind of the heritage models, which this one is one of them. They're actually rebooting and restarting making discontinued parts, but they don't know what to make if you don't request it. So if you're an 80 series owner and there is one part you wish they still made and they discontinued, you should go to GR Heritage Parts, request that part. The more people request the same part, that means there is a high demand for this part in the enthusiast community. They're gonna actually start producing that part again at an astronomical price, don't get me wrong, but at least we're gonna get something that is original. So I just thought I'd mention this. Folks, buy the right 80 series with the right intention and the right state of mind going into it. You're going to love it because these things are awesome. There is no other way to say it. But buy it for the wrong reasons, or worse, buy the wrong one. It is going to be a very bad experience from day one. That's all I'll tell you. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.